Hi, I'm Sam McAdam and welcome to Air Chats with Air Max. Our next guest is known as Big Bird, Wellesley, and is a self-published author of this book, An Officer, Not a Gentleman. We welcome on Air Chats, Mandy Hickson. Good morning, Mandy Hickson. Welcome to Air Chats with Air Max. Pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks for agreeing to come on.
My pleasure. Lovely to be here, Sam. Great to meet you.
We were chatting beforehand, well, literally before we started recording, the fact that you're a bit of a podcast OG. You've done a few. I know you've done a few, but I was explaining the format of the show is I try not to do any research on guests. So I know that your name's Mandy Hickson, that you flew Tornado. And other than that, I'm not really familiar with your career or your stories.
I think it's good, isn't it? Because it means that your job's a lot easier as well. So you don't have to spend hours and hours reading all the books and all that sort of thing as well.
I'm
so
lazy,
I think it's good.
basically.
In other words, you're a lazy bastard, yeah. No, I'm joking.
It's fine. Would you like to tell us about your aviation journey? That's what I ask every guest, but How did it all start?
Sure. So I joined the Air Force in 1994. First got into flying through the Air Cadets. So very similar journey to lots of other people, using that route of the Air Cadets in. I flew with them, loved it. And women weren't allowed to be pilots at that stage though. And went off to university having got a flying scholarship. University, I was at Birmingham and I joined the University Air Squadron. So now a continuation of the Air Cadets. Flew with them, got 160 hours. So I'm now on about 200 flying hours. And in my second year, they changed the rules. Applied to join, failed all the tests to be in, not once, but twice. Fortunately, in the end, they took me on as a test case because they couldn't understand why so many women were failing these tests compared to men. And then I joined in 1994 and went through the whole system as per a lot of other people do, all the standard sort of courses, and ended up flying the Tornado GR4 on the front line on 2 Squadron down at Marham. Very quickly, 3 tours of duty in Iraq in the build up to Gulf War II. So we just left the Gulf when Operation Telic, Gulf War II kicked off. So we were back home by then. And then, served for 17 years in total, and then 8 years as a reservist flying Air Cadets, and then finally hung up my flying boots in COVID because all the aeroplanes were grounded and I haven't gone back to it since.
I should have been taking notes.
Yeah, I was going to say that is the quickest I have ever gone through.
Well, so much more time for like other chats about
exactly
unrelated aviation stuff.
Oh, lovely.
But we are here for that. And let's take it back to I joined the Air Force. It was illegal to be a fighter pilot back then.
Well, a pilot full stop, actually, when I was first looking at doing it. So when I was 13, women were just not allowed to be pilots in the Air Force. And whenever I suggested it to anyone that this is what I was going to do, I was just laughed upon. And they said, what about the police? And in the end, I was like, yeah, okay, I'll join the police. But in the back of my mind thinking, no, I will become a pilot.
Okay. The reason I asked that is because we had Jo on, obviously, and she was in the same boat. But you joined and you said, I'm going to be a pilot. It was illegal to be a pilot back then. So what was the ultimate goal at that point?
So Jo was a bit different to myself because she was already in the Air Force when they changed the rules. So she was a sponsored engineer and had gone through officer training when they changed the rules. So she was in a perfect position to literally swap across and then go down the fast jet route, which was fantastic. And Jo's a great friend of mine. So we spent, quite a lot of time together. But bizarrely, we never met in the Air Force, interestingly. So we've always said it would have been a nightmare if we were on a squadron together because, quite frankly, we would have got into a lot of trouble. We were just chatting the other day about how those journeys were different in some ways because she was doing really well through flying training and then ended up at RAF Valley as an instructor. And then they changed the rules again, allowing women to fly on the front line. And she then just swapped across and could fly the Tornado. For myself, I was at university in 91 to 94 when they changed the rules. So I was one of the first sort of intake that was coming in when the rules changed and we were then actually allowed to apply and go through the process. So when I joined in 94, there were a few other women that were already going through the system in front of me as well. And you've obviously got Nikki, who then also flew. She was flying the Hercules as well. So women were allowed to be flying other aircraft, but just not on the front line of fast jet operations.
You mentioned Nikki who? On the spot now.
On the spot. I was just going to think, because her name's changed, of course, because she got married, and I can't think what her actual her name was. But anyway, so she was the very first pilot anyway. It'll come to me. I'll tell you later.
And you mentioned that there were some failures. Again, we went through very quickly, but you failed. Yeah. What did you fail?
Failed many different times, actually. So the aptitude tests, which are the computer-based aptitude tests, they're called CBATs now. Mm-hmm. When I took them, I failed them completely, and you're only allowed to take them twice, and I failed them the second time. And actually, in failing them that second time, I was worried that was it. But actually, there was a boss on my university air squadron, and he basically sat there and thought, hold on a minute, this doesn't make sense. Mandy's a really good pilot in the air. Why can't she pass the tests? And so it sort of spotlighted it a bit, because he then started to challenge the process a bit. And he found out that on investigation that a lot of women were failing the tests outright. And there was a very, very different distribution curve to how women were passing those tests compared to men. So the men was a classic Yerkes-Dodson sort of bell curve, with not many failing, not many passing at a really high level, but the majority were sort of in that middle ground. But for women, the women that passed it were passing it at normally an incredibly high level, but the majority were failing. And so they said, hold on a minute, these tests were designed however many trillions of years ago, maybe by men, for men to pass. Maybe we need to look at the tests. Mm-hmm. And actually, in taking me on as a test case, they decided that they would re-engineer those tests. And they did, and they took 4 years to redesign them. And then they invited myself, and there were a couple of other people who had failed those tests initially as well, invited us back and got us to do the new tests. And it was the most stressful day of my life, because I was flying tornadoes by then. And I thought, my gosh, what happens if I now fail the tests? Am I just rubbish? Well, they just say, you're out. We might have spent £4 million training you, but quite frankly, you still can't pass the tests. So no, and I passed those with flying colours. And actually it was just, it basically just, put it into concrete, the fact that actually those tests there had been an unconscious bias within that testing system, which we'd uncovered.
I don't know if it's going to be a boring question for you, but because of Joe Salter, John Peters, Rory Underwood, we've spoken about aptitude tests quite a lot, but I'm saying aptitude tests and listening to test without really knowing what it is. I'm picturing like a hazard awareness when you're trying to do your provisional license.
Yeah.
And
so
we've done
like that, but different.
Because you're already flying, and I would be really interested to know what it's like, what the setup is, what is the intention of the test, where do you go for it, what happens in it? Yeah,
so the test lasts about 4 hours. They're done at RAF Cranwell at the Officer Aircrew and Selection Centre at Cranwell. And they're basically all done on a computer. So originally, if you can imagine, there used to be tests like, and I'm not sure, I can't remember, this is a long time ago. There'd be things like, for example, if you can imagine a box and you've got a ball in that box, and that ball is constantly trying to escape from the box, and you have got a joystick, and every time that ball starts to move up the screen, you instinctively push it down to keep it in the box. And so every time, so it's basically testing how quickly are you responding to an input that you're seeing. And then halfway through, when you've absolutely nailed this and you're seeing any tiny movements and you're really keeping it stable, they change the input so it goes the opposite way round. So suddenly when you push down, it actually shoots it up and you're thinking, whoa, that's crazy. And it's, again, how quickly do you adapt to a changing environment? How quickly do you reprogram your brain to say that is no longer down, it's now up? And so there's lots of things like that. There's obviously maths ones in there. There's memory recall. There's sort of navigation type, maths type exercises and questions as well. There's sort of recognition ones where they'll show lots of different pictures of different aircraft lengths and you'll say, shoot it down or not. And you've got to be able to spot the difference in tiny differences in sort of wing length. And they'll say, this is an enemy aircraft, this is a friendly one. How often are you shooting the wrong one down? Things like that in the aptitude test. They had changed a bit, but to be honest, it's so long ago, I can't actually remember. You'd be better asking someone that's been through a bit more recently.
I appreciate the answer. That was a good answer, actually. And I was wondering if you have to do that ball exercise for like the whole 4 hours.
Oh, I see. No.
There's other stuff.
I used to think actually a really good practice for this would be, do you ever remember like Sonic the Hedgehog?
Yes.
You know that game where you go and do a bonus round and he's in a tunnel and there's the rings and you've got to stagger, time it so that you go round and pick up the rings at the same pace that you're progressing down that tunnel. And that's how you get all your gold rings. And if you do it too fast, then you're going to miss all the gold rings. If you do it too slowly, you'll miss them. So you've got to hit the exact same rate of change that you're seeing the rings. That's a really perfect one for an aptitude test because it's basically seeing how quickly you're adapting your hand-to-eye coordination with what's going on the screen.
So now we'll have like lots of
people practicing Sonic the
computer, like Sega Mega Drives. Those that still have them,
yeah. Oh,
going.
exactly.
I'm going to be a fighter pilot.
I'm going to be
now.
fighter. I can do this. I can do Sonic. Yeah.
Well, and everyone does the same test, and then there must be thresholds. And,
yeah, absolutely.
And that determines what equipment you go to fly.
No, it doesn't. It just will determine whether or not you are streamed or even given the ability to be offered the position as pilot, observer, whatever. So if you don't pass a certain threshold, then ultimately you'll say, actually, you've not passed to be a pilot or an observer or a air traffic controller, and the different tests that you're doing there will say you've got an aptitude to be a weapon system operator, or you have an aptitude to be an air traffic controller, just on what you're seeing, or a fighter controller. And they'll give you those. And actually, because they can see where your strengths are, they're going to hopefully pick a career within the Air Force that would match your strengths.
Okay, clear. And very helpful.
My pleasure.
A lot more to it than what I thought it was, like a hazard perception test.
Although those are really quite tricky. I was helping my son with those ones, and they are quite tricky, some of them.
You can just click randomly and hope you
click
get
randomly
it right.
and think, is that too dangerous yet? Am I too close? Oh, God, no.
And you drive, obviously.
I do drive, yes.
Prefer driving or flying?
Flying.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But you casually dropped in there that I was flying Tornado and then I was asked to come back to do this test. Right, yeah, you just casually dropped in that you flew Tornado. GR4, and I thought it was F3.
Oh, gosh, sorry, bad cough there. No, sorry to any of the F3 pilots out there or drivers. No, flew the GR4, yes.
Okay, should we talk about the Tornado GR4? I mean, that's awesome. To someone like me that's not really been near a fighter jet, that's a serious bit of equipment.
It is a serious bit of kit. And I remember going from flying the Hawk, which I would describe as it's the sports car of the fast jet world. The Red Arrows fly it. It's really agile. It's nippy. It's like a mini metro sort of feel to it. You arrive to fly the Tornado and you go out and it's massive. It's got a step ladder that you have to go up to get into it, and it's really huge. And I just remember looking at it thinking, oh my God, it sort of felt like about 3 times the size of a Hawk. And yeah, it's amazing as well. I mean, it's got, afterburners, it's got thrust reverse, it's got someone sitting in the back seat to help you, but it's also got the tech. And I think the big step up when you're leaving flying, say, the Hawk, where the Hawk was a training aircraft and all the flying that you were doing within the Hawk was done to test you, to push you. And they would describe it as an advanced driving test twice a day for 10 months. It's really challenging. And then you finish the Hawk and you now go to fly the Tornado. And suddenly, hold on a minute, I've got systems on board now that are here to help me because I've learned how to fly and now I'm going to be learning how to fight. And that's a real difference. So I never felt going through the Tornado operational conversion unit at Lossiemouth that they were there to chop you, to prove that you couldn't do it. It was more, we're here to ensure that you can do it. You have proved that you are good enough. Now let's make sure you can fight this thing. And, you've got a head-up display now. We had a moving map. You had a GPS. So you've now got loads of information that's giving you your position. You've got someone in the back as well that you're working as a really good team. And there's a real division of duties. I mean, you might assume that it's all about the pilot, and it's absolutely not that at all. And in fact, when I was flying in the Gulf, I used to sort of feel that I was very much a taxi driver to ensure that I got the weapon systems operator or the navigator to the right point in the sky to ensure that they could do the job they had to do. Because, people always think, oh, pilots are the glory, but it's really not that. And it really is a team effort.
Well, you've identified something that I was thinking as you were speaking, I was thinking exactly the same thing. Is it's nice for you to offer a perspective like that, because I would have said exactly what you said. Is it's all about the pilots. You know, the spotlight is on you. And then to refer to yourself as almost like a taxi driver.
Well, I know, and I literally, someone said it to me once, and I thought, actually, do you know what, that is it? Because especially in the Gulf, you know, for us, that was a medium level war. So we were flying up at 20,000 feet. So you're sort of disassociated with what you're doing. You know, if you can get your nav to the right point in the sky, and if you're going to be doing reconnaissance, you're following them completely in what they're saying, where you're going. They're operating all the kit. But if you're on a weapons sortie, as in you're going to be attacking a target, you will be dropping a weapon on their say when you cannot see what you're dropping on. So you want to talk about trust. That is it. You know, you could potentially be taking someone's life, and there's a huge responsibility in that, on the trust of somebody else. Now, they are putting their trust in you every single time they get airborne, because they don't have a stick. They can't fly the aeroplane. So if you do something wrong in the front seat, you could be jeopardising their life as well.
Yeah, serious. I mean, on Civvy Street, it's pulling out of a junction whilst your passenger's telling you it's clear.
Yes, it is that.
And you're not allowed to look. But that you're only putting yourselves at risk there. In this situation, you're literally dropping bombs.
Yeah.
The first time you got in a tornado, had you been in a sim?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you a passenger the first time?
No, you're not. So you do, I think it was 8 or 10 simulator sorties, sort of an hour, maybe an hour and a half each. And by the time you get into the tornado, you are flying. So there's very few tornadoes, which they're called twin stickers, and they're the training tornado. So basically you have a pilot that can sit in the back seat and they can fly it as well.
Okay.
So there's very few of those around, but they're obviously there for the training environment. So a squadron will have one as well, so that people can do all like what's called their QFI checks, their qualified flying instructor checks. And so on the operational conversion unit, they'll have a few of those. So your very first trip, you have got a pilot sitting in the back seat. But basically, they're not really doing an awful lot, in as much as they're saying, okay, Mandy, you've been in the sim, you've done 10 sorties in the sim, over to you. And I do remember, and I remember this because it's fresh because I was writing it in my book, is that lining up on the runway for the very first time you take off in a tornado, and you light the burners individually, sort of click one in, you click the second one in, and when you feel it, you can feel this boom, boom, and then you hold it on the brakes, you stick them forward, and you are literally thrust back into your seat. You get about 2G of lateral acceleration. Have you ever been on stealth at Thorpe Park?
I've not actually, no.
Oh, you're missing out. Well, if anyone has, that is as close as you'll ever get to taking off in a fast jet. And it's basically you'll queue for 3 hours and you will do a 10-second, trip on this roller coaster, but it's the biggest thrill. And I made my boys go on it when we were at Thorpe Park. So I went, this is as close as you're ever going to get to taking off in a fast jet. And they were like, that is quite cool. They didn't really care actually at the time because I was just mum. But I hopefully they'll care a bit more as they're now older. But it's a really interesting one, that thrust back and then you are plastered into your seat. But that amount of power that is being generated, but when you're in full, when you've got those burners lit, is unbelievable.
That is because a sim isn't going to simulate that.
No. And that's the one thing you don't actually get, is that feeling. They are full motion simulators, but you don't get that lateral acceleration. You wouldn't get that feeling perhaps of G-force. It moves and you do feel like you're moving. And my goodness, the Sims now, I mean, they're the next generation, obviously for things like F-35 and Typhoon, phenomenal. I mean, what they're doing in the Sims now is they're actually utilising a lot of the training that you would be doing normally, for myself, would have done in the air. They now do it all in the simulator. So it's about 50-50. So they've lost out on a lot of flying time. And that's the only slight issue that they are seeing with people on the front line now, is that they haven't got quite as much situational awareness because they've not grown up flying as many hours in the actual air when you build up that airmanship.
And do you think that could cost the military in the long term?
I hope not. I mean, the sort of sorties that they are doing are phenomenal, But it is just something that they need to be very aware of. You know, I don't know what the hourly rate is to fly an F-35. I'm guessing it is a hell of a lot of money. I think they used to say it was, I mean, I don't know what the Tornado used to be. It was something like £10,000 an hour or something like that. So F-35 is going to be one heck of a lot more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, but you kind of feel that might be the incentive for this new training strategy.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff that they're doing in the sim, though, and the sims are very, very realistic. But, you know, you can't beat actually being in the air and poor weather coming in and having to make decisions and all of those sorts of airmanship decisions that perhaps you can't 100% replicate when you're in a simulator, because you know you're not going to die as a consequence of your actions in a sim. And I think there is that whole feeling of, you know, you might make a slightly different decision knowing that life is not on the line compared to what it is in the air.
I completely agree with you on that. Having done a little bit of firearms training when I was in my early 20s, it was that same thing.
Yeah.
You were never going to get shot. Someone's shooting at you, but you knew you were safe. Whether you discharge or not, you're not actually taking a life. It's all being simulated. And that real world scenario is a lot different.
Yeah.
Like you said, relying on your nav to give you the information that you need to make a decision safely.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, you'd have laughed, actually. I was with Joe Salter at the International Air Tattoo, and we were wandering around, and we got hijacked by all the air cadets and taken into theirs, and we would start to do a virtual reality sort of combat, like a laser quest, basically. They had it in this tent. Joe and I embarrassed ourselves so enormously. We got shot at 17 times and we didn't make one kill. And it's all on video. The air cadets have loved it. I'm surprised it hasn't gone viral, these two women wandering around like looking like absolute loons. But it was really funny. So, yeah.
We should go viral now.
We should go viral now. I mean, my goodness, get the footage of Joe and I as these blundering idiots.
Well, I feel like we actually might move off from the kind of conventional podcast structure of talking about tornadoes and whatnot. Please do, but I mean, it's going to be what the audience want to hear. Of
course.
But maybe, because you have done so many podcasts, I want to touch on the unknown Mandy, the Mandy we don't know.
Oh my God, I'm not talking about that. Jesus. So how long have we got?
But you can censor it.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's not? Oh yeah, the Les Dennis moment.
Yeah, exactly.
But what's not been covered? What's actually been something that you're really passionate about, that you find really interesting or funny, other than Manchester United? That you've not covered before in any sort of interview, speakers event.
I mean, something that I am really passionate about and that I love talking about now, actually. And so what I do now is I'm a speaker, keynote speaker at conferences, and I often do like motivational ones as well, but I also do quite a lot of safety ones. And I'm about to sound probably quite boring now, but one of my real passions is looking at like the human factors training, about how the humans interact within those systems and things like that. So if you think about, you and I, before we went on air, we're just sort of saying, how does a tornado pilot's experiences relate to a sandwich factory in Scunthorpe, for example? But if you actually look at that, processes, protocols, regulations, compliance, all of these words that we think are a bit tedious. They're all the dirty words type thing of like, do we have to? Is it a tick box exercise? When you're looking at a sandwich factory, if they make mistakes, and people actually can get really ill as a consequence. If you're talking about the oil and gas industry, people will die if they get it wrong. So actually these high risk industries, be that the food prep, be that chemical, oil and gas, it doesn't really matter, or healthcare, all of those same lessons apply and can be read across really readily. And I think it's particularly around that human factor. And I love the area where we talk a lot about failure and talking openly about our mistakes, because I think this is something that the aviation world have actually really led on, is the just culture and having a really open and honest reporting culture. And it's an area that is not quite as widely embraced in other organizations and other companies as well, because failure is often seen as a dirty word, isn't it? We don't like to fail. I mean, can you think about, say, you're at school, you do a spelling test, you've got 9 out of 10, and what do your parents or your carers say when you come home? What was the one you got wrong? Okay, because we only ever focus on the negative, isn't it? I got 9 A's and an F. What was your F in? So we always focus on this negative, and that's considered that's the failure bit. And so because that failure has always felt like a bad thing, when we then get into the workplace and suddenly now we're in a culture where we say, tell you what, Sam, I really want to know about mistakes that you make. You think, of course you don't. I don't want to talk about mistakes I make, because ultimately, if I got away with it, why would I tell anyone? And it's really important that, we take the work that we've done within aviation where, in the 1990s, we saw, technology was improving massively, and yet we saw our accident rate going through the roof as well. And we were like, what? This doesn't make sense. Technology should be helping the accident rate to come down. And that's when they realized that one of the comments they were so often hearing on that black box post a crash was, what's it doing now? I'm disconnected from the system. So what they introduced was this crew resource management, human performance factors. And it covered everything from stress, fatigue, threat and error management, culture, communication, decision-making, situational awareness, all of these things. And actually it trained people in it. And it became mandatory in 92 to do an initial course, and then mandatory in 95 to do a recurrent course. So every single pilot, cabin crew, air crew will go through this training as well yearly to remind them of the importance of this human factors training.
That's not boring at all.
You were glazing over, no, well,
Well, I always got to decide what's the best question to ask next, because it is a raw chat. So you say something and I'm like,
yeah.
Well, where do we go on from here? But it's what avenue I choose.
Absolutely.
Because there's a lot to discuss.
Yeah.
Is that civilian and military?
Yep. So, I mean, it was brought in originally was for civilian. They led the front on it, actually. And it's now mandatory as well for all military pilots have to go through it too.
It's an interesting subject because, like I mentioned, I was thinking quite a lot of things. One being, I pick my toddler up from nursery and I'm not allowed to use the word naughty. They're not allowed to use the word naughty. But call me old school. I don't know. You get into this kind of age issue, how old we are and what generation we're from, what's okay, what's not okay. Helen said something on the last podcast which was interesting, and it was about failures. Let's assume the commander, I'm just going to say commander because I don't know what the structure is. If someone makes a mistake and then someone else later on down the line makes the same mistake, they'll all be held accountable because they all should have sat down and said, I made this mistake. This is what I did wrong. This is how you rectify it.
Yeah.
And then it shouldn't happen again to anyone else. So even though it's been addressed, you as an individual are at fault in those environments, you should all take it on board. And I thought that was really, really poignant because when I've worked, corporate world, you sit down, you have an appraisal or a performance review, but it's just you and your manager and you talk about your individual performance.
Yeah.
And when do the people actually sit down and go, us as a wider team need to address these things?
And that comes back to the debrief you see as well. So if you think every single flight you ever fly in military or civilian world, you will debrief it afterwards. And it is mandatory. It is as important as the flight itself. And when I speak to businesses and I say, do you debrief? They go, oh, not as often as we should. We just never have time. And they certainly don't in the medical world either. And you think, well, if you don't make time, how do you ever learn? You want to be these high-performing teams. You want to be agile, adaptable, all of these great buzzwords. But if you're not actually putting any time to say what went well, what went badly, and what could I do more of, then how are you ever going to grow? And I think that whole point there that you said that Helen had mentioned as well, I think is really, really important. And the point there is, how many times would if you ever hear yourself saying, I could have told you that would happen. If you could have told me it was going to happen then, why didn't you? And that is the whole point. If you ever hear yourself saying that, it's about actually saying something, and they talk about this. I did a really interesting session with the police force actually, and I loved it. And I sat up at the start and I said, it was to about 100 senior police officers from lots and lots of different areas. And at the start I said, who has made a mistake that they want to chat about? And there was like tumbleweed. And I just let this tumbleweed blow. I wanted the silence. I wanted it to be really uncomfortable. And it was really uncomfortable. And I let it become really uncomfortable. And I said, okay, obviously no one's feeling open enough to talk. And then we started to talk about there's been so many studies that have been done when you look at industrial accidents, aviation accidents, and we always get this same structure. For every one crash, one big event, loss of life, you will have 30 minor events where an incident went in, where that could be, let's say in the workplace, that could be a loss of a limb or a slip disc. Sorry, Sam. Or it could be an injury, but a report went in. But beneath your waterline, there will be 300 near misses where people got away with it, where they don't have to put a report in, and some of the times they don't bother. If you're only getting information about the 1 and the 30, you are missing this enormous database of the potential incidents that could be happening. So you're always going to be reactive. So if you can actually build trust within your organization where people talk openly about their 300 events, then ultimately you're creating a proactive learning culture. Now that takes time to build, of course it does. So we had an entire session with the police. It was about over 2 hours. Lots of stuff was talked about. And the very last thing I said was, okay, on your tables, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to talk about any really good 300 events that you've had that you want to share. I couldn't stop them talking. We had to extend the session. We went straight into the lunch break, another half an hour, and we're like, I really think we should go for lunch. Because ultimately, there were so many wonderful 300 events they wanted to share that right at the end, I said, thank you for sharing all your mistakes. We have now got them captured. And they all sort of went, oh my God, they are our mistakes. But all we had done was reframe the language. And so if you are in a leadership position, when we talk about what makes a good leader and all of those sorts of aspects, to me, it's about authenticity. It's about being vulnerable. It's about showing that you do make mistakes. And if you look at, say, the Red Arrows, my very last flight in a military aircraft was with the Red Arrows. And I flew 3 sorties with them. And it was an absolutely phenomenal day. I thought I knew about flying, and it was just absolutely brilliant. But what I loved more than anything was the debrief and the honesty that Red 1 displayed when he stood up. And you had all of these civilians at the back who'd won this raffle prize and could come and watch some Red Arrows fly. And I was having the excitement of flying with them. And instantly Red 1 said, okay, did anyone spot my first mistake? And he showed vulnerability. And in doing so, you're setting the tone from the top that others want to follow. And I think just by having that open dialogue, therefore, about mistakes, your entire culture starts to change. And after that event with the police, I went into about 4 different stations afterwards, and there was a triangle on their board when you first walked into the station, and it just had 130, 300. 300 was circled and said, what's been your latest 300 event? And I was like, oh my God. And they said, we're opening our meetings by asking that question. That to me shows a growth mindset, and that's really, really powerful.
Definitely. I don't know if there's a term for like corporate washing. You got sports washing and whatnot. Do you feel like this issue exists because it's become a bit of a drab exercise? When you do sit down, it's booking a meeting, it's an event where you've got it's almost like you're trying to tick a box rather than, like you said, Red 1 goes, did anyone spot my mistake? It's just at any moment, at any time when it's appropriate to do so, to address it. But big organisations almost wait for a specific moment.
Well, they also wait until the end of a big project or the end of something, and they go, okay, now we need to have our wash up. And you sort of go, why not just do it much more regularly? So like you'll have a meeting, like we could finish this podcast and we could say at the end, okay, what went well, what went badly, and what could you do more of? And instantly you're going, oh, I should have done that, and now you can think for the next one, I've now got something to build on. But if you're always waiting till the end of the series and then you say, let me look back over all of those podcasts and see what I could have done better, well, you're not going to capture them. And something as well that I was working with one organisation, we were talking about how to give feedback to people. And how often do you wait for the 360 appraisal, end of year, 6 monthly, where you sit in with the one-on-one with your boss or your commander. I'm still sure it's not called a commander in the commercial world. But ultimately with your senior, and you get this wash up from them, this debrief. But ultimately I said, what about developing Boost? And I've seen this being used in some aviation concepts as well. And it's when you give feedback and you say it's balanced, objective, observed, specific, and timely. So when you say to someone, rather than kind of just give you some feedback, instantly you go, no, I don't want to receive it, because the hackles go back on our hairs on our neck, don't they? We don't really want to receive feedback. It's always going to feel like a negative connotation. But if I said to you, Sam, can I give you a boost? You're thinking, I might get some chocolate, happy days. But you also might be thinking, hold on a minute, I'm going to have something that's going to make me better. And it's just, again, reframing how our brain is now ready to accept what is about to be said to us. So, when we give feedback, it shouldn't be one way. I shouldn't be telling you it. It should be facilitated. So I should be asking you, what do you think you're doing well? I should be asking you about how you could improve, because ultimately we should say that our feedback is understood, accepted, and capable of change.
Yeah.
Am I stunning you with my witty repartee now, you see?
I'm impressed. We haven't even got onto the book yet.
No.
But I'm thinking about the whole process. It's like you said, you're going, oh, may I give you some feedback? Do we even need to do that? I've got an Eastern European mother, for example.
Right, so she gives you feedback.
There's no dressing this up. You're not asked if you want feedback. No. You're told brutally what it is that you've done.
And do you quite like that direct approach?
I do. And what's really interested me is working alongside kind of Russians, Ukrainians in my industry, air charter industry, is that culture that I'm familiar with it. And a lot of people, it's created a bit of conflict.
Of course.
In the office environments, because a lot of people don't know how to take direct feedback that isn't dressed up for you. We talk about shit sandwiches, don't we?
Of course.
Or that you're not being prepared for it.
Yeah.
And then that made me think about family life. Like you said, you're married, I'm married. We don't do that with maybe you do that with your partner. But.
Well, he's ex-Navy, so I have to give him a lot of feedback. No, I'm joking. I like the Navy, I promise. They are the senior service, don't you know? Sorry, I've been brainwashed.
Yes.
Living with him for too long. Yeah. Actually, no, we don't do it as much in our relationships, do we? But actually, I tell you what, I did have a bit of a fallout with a friend recently, and she's one of my best friends. And it was a really interesting one. And there'd been like 3 things where I was getting more and more sort of upset about. And I thought, God, I'm so good at this in the workplace. Why am I not so good at doing this in my personal life? And so I said to her, can we go for a walk? And as we started walking, I said, I've got 3 things that I need to discuss with you. And she was like, oh my God, I feel like I should have got an agenda item, out here. And I said, I feel like I've been really let down as a friend recently. And she was like, what? And I said, can I just get this all off my chest? Because I hate conflict. I've always hated conflict, which is ironic seeing as I did the job I did, but personal conflict particularly. Yeah. And I back away from it. And so I said, look, I need to get this off my chest. And she said, oh my goodness, that was really interesting hearing from your perspective on all of those things. Because when someone lets me down, I take that as a real, loyalty to me is everything, and reliability, because these are the values that I've grown up with and were embedded with my time in the military. You never let your teammate down. That is almost like my biggest, sacrilegious thing I could do would be to let someone down. Out of her, she says, I've got no problems cancelling at the last minute. I was like, I know. And that's why I find it upsetting. But it was really interesting that wasn't one of her big values. And so when I then heard it from her perspective, I listened to it and I thought, right, actually, I can see all of this from your perspective. And it was so refreshing. And then we went, great, well, we've got all that off the chest. Should we go and have some lunch? But it was so important to do that because it was really, really upsetting me. Mm-hmm. And she was completely oblivious. And so I was holding it against her, but without actually ever telling her.
Well, we often do that.
I know we do, but it's crazy.
And then I heard, I'm not overly familiar with Myers-Briggs theory. Yeah. You've heard of that?
Yeah, Myers-Briggs. I mean, it's basically looking at all our personality types and things like that.
But that's similar to what you were talking about, right? So
yeah, it is. And I think it's really great. I love one actually called Insights, which is it's a personality test that it looks at your colours. And quite a lot of organisations have done this Insights test. And basically you end up with blocks and it's red, yellow, green and blue. And then at the end of it, they will actually give you a block that you can put on your desk. So I could instantly go into a room and I would perhaps say, Sam is a red. And so I would now think, I know how to speak to you, Sam, because if I'm a blue, I'm all about attention to detail, but Sam is not about attention to detail because he's all about communication. He's all about the person. So, for example, when I did this Insights thing, I was working with a friend of mine and she said to me afterwards, she said, this makes so much sense now, Mandy, because when you write emails to me, you which is why I've now had to get a PA, because quite frankly, if you sent me an email and you've asked me 7 questions, I will literally cut and paste those 7 questions and go, yes, no, no, yes, yes, no. Because why would I waste time? And then I think, oh gosh, I better make it nice. Dear Sam, thank you so much for inviting me to come on your podcast. Yes, no, no, yes, yes, no, yeah. Really looking forward to seeing you. And I almost have to go and put those tops and bottoms in, because I am really aware that the written word for me is pretty tedious. And so actually, I just want to be as succinct as possible, and I want to answer you as quickly as possible. So she was asking me questions, and I would literally send her an email back just going, no. And she'd go, oh my God, what have I done to offend you? You haven't asked me how my weekend was, and wasn't it lovely and sunny and all those? And I'm thinking, well, what was the point? You asked me a question, I answered it. Now she knows that actually my blue is really small. She goes, that makes so much more sense. And so actually understanding the people that we work with by doing something like the Insights or a Myers-Briggs gives you so much more knowledge about the people that you're working with. And it even gives you, and one thing I really liked about the Insights was that if you were, say, a big red character with yellow, it gives you tips of how you speak to a blue. How do you interact with different people who are not like yourself? And that's really powerful as well. So you start to just basically build up so much more knowledge, especially if you're in a small knit team.
Yeah, it's important. I don't know why not even bigger organisations. I worked for 10 years, quite a large organisation, and nothing like that existed. Ooh. And it would have been really handy. The example I wanted to give was when you go for a business meeting, you've got to take an aeroplane. I go to an airport 2 hours before departure.
Yeah.
Other people in my team would be 10 minutes.
Cutting it a bit more finely.
Yeah, which can create conflict and really stress you out if you're the one that's there early and you don't know whether they're going to turn up on time. And then they turn up and they're like, oh God, nearly missed my flight. Well, that was kind of your fault because you decided to leave it last minute. But these little things allow you to know in advance who you're dealing with.
Absolutely. And I think knowing it for your partner as well is really important. So my husband we did a test once in the military, and it was, are you a work now, play later, or a play now, work later? And they made us go to the separate ends of the classroom to determine whether you were one of those sorts of people. And out of, say, like 30 that were doing this course, only 2 of us went to the play now, work later. And all the other 28 were at this end. And they looked at us and they said, but are you really? Would you really play if you knew that you had a work deadline? And I was like, yeah. And actually my husband happened to be in that training room as well. And he was like, God, just honestly, that's abhorrent to him, because he is a plan. Only when the job is done would he then go out. And he said, I just can't believe that you would be like that. And I thought, when I think back to university, I would be play. I've got a deadline. Oh my God, it's a nightmare. And he said, I've seen you now the whole of your career, Mandy, even after you left the Air Force and then setting up your own business. You'd be going out to Vienna to deliver a presentation there was a huge one actually to the United Nations at a International Atomic Energy Agency conference. And, they'd asked for this deadline to get these slides sent to them. And it was not a normal presentation I was giving. I was basically doing a session about how can we take all the lessons from aviation and put them into a nuclear power plant and learn from them. So it was definitely not my, happy motivational speech. It was a really serious presentation. And he said, when did you say those slides needed to be in? I was like, yeah, they need to be in tomorrow. And he was going, when are you actually going to do those? And I was like, I work much better under pressure. And he's like, I think that's rubbish. And I was like, watch me. And he said, well, are we going out for food tonight? I was like, yeah, we are. And I always have done that. But interestingly, as I'm getting older, I realise that I wouldn't say not pack a bag, for example. If I'm leaving at, say, 5 a.m. in the following morning, I wouldn't pack the bag. I'd get up at 4:45 and go, oh God, I feel so stressed. And I wouldn't actually sleep the night before because I'm thinking, I mustn't forget to pack those things. But it was almost this sort of sense of pride, this badge of honour of, look at me leaving things to the last minute. But actually it stressed me out. And as I've got older, I've learnt from him, gosh, I hope he doesn't listen to this because he'd have to get obviously some favour as a consequence. But I've learnt actually to pack the bag the night before, that actually it is less stressful arriving at the airport with 2 hours to go. And guess what? You can just then sit and have a coffee somewhere and it is chilled, as opposed to me going, well, look at me. I screeched in with an hour to go and I've cut it all finely and all the rest of it. So I have always been that person, but I have now learned to adapt my behaviours.
But you were that person when you were flying Tornado GR4.
Yeah, which is slightly concerning, isn't it?
Well, no, I'm just thinking kudos to you.
Yeah.
Well done, because I'm now picturing, okay, a bit of a Hollywood scene. Everyone's in the briefing room, the screen's up like this, and they go, right, this target, and so I go, where's Mandy?
Here she comes.
Everyone's there.
Here I am.
And you kind of, roll in.
I was much more disciplined. I think that was my personal life. Well, I suppose it wasn't really because it was then, but it was my choices. In the military, I think, it's very prescriptive. You've got a 4-hour briefing period, a planning period, a 2-hour briefing, 2-hour mission, 2-hour debrief. People just think, oh, they just get airborne and they go flying. All the planning that goes into it is phenomenal.
And you're not, I wanted to come back to non-conflict. Yeah. Because we're back on the subject of Tornado.
Yeah.
And I was hoping we'd get here naturally because you said earlier you don't like conflict. So I think you have been in a fight or flight scenario whilst flying. You don't like conflict, but you obviously didn't fly.
Oh, no. So conflict for me is personal conflict. I hate any personal issues and I back away from that. Conflict as in fighting in a war zone, that's fine. That's very different. So I know that sounds crazy, but I think it's probably more from your upbringing of seeing, say, parents arguing or things like that you think, I never want to have that. So I could never now be in a relationship where I argued with my partner. I just couldn't do it. That would be a non-negotiable. And so, but when it came to perhaps it being in a war zone, I have no issues whatsoever. I mean, I was never fearful of being shot down. I was only ever fearful of letting my team down.
Mandy, on every episode, Ryan, who's sitting over there, the legend, he always puts these brilliant shorts clips together. And there's usually one, they're like a minute long. There's usually one which is like the one. With JP, John Peters, for example, it was just this minute long. Rant is not rant, but
if it's knowing JP, it was probably a rant.
A rant.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
But kind of like just combat, just madness. Oh, there's stuff coming out the burners, 750 kilogram, I'm being shot there. There's the enemy, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. What's your 1 minute hook for this episode? And then maybe we could talk about
sure. It would probably be the evening that we were engaged by a surface-to-air missile in Iraq. So I was leading my first ever combat mission as a junior pilot, and I was leading a 4-ship. It was about 2:00 in the morning. In the run-up to that night, the arterial routes between Baghdad in the north and Al-Basra down in the south had always been busy. But once we got to the Saudi border, nothing had ever happened. And so now our biggest threat normally is complacency. I swept up my last target because we were basically doing a show of force or a little bit of reconnaissance. And I started to relax when my navigator just yelled, Mandy, brake right. Instantly, I followed his order, slamming the throttles fully forward. We rolled quickly to 120 degrees, pulled hard towards the ground, and he starts putting out all the flares. And the reason was the surface-to-air missile had just launched and it had locked onto the heat of my engines. And it was one of those moments where you practice and practice this maneuver, never with the thought of actually having to do it. And here we were doing it for real. We watched this surface-to-air missile go from being locked on, and it pulled off and exploded about 2.5 miles away, which felt pretty close. And at that point, the entire mission changed, and we were then retasked to carry out what's called a response option on a target. It was a radar station, but we were running out of fuel. It's 2:00 in the morning. There's a blowing sandstorm coming up from the south of Saudi, and we decided that we'd head south towards a tanker, an airborne tanker. We got down there. It was not our British one. Ours had broken. It was an American tanker, KC-135, that I had no clearance to tank from. I'd never done it before. It has a really different refueling system. My boss was in my formation and I said to him, can I have a go? He said, yeah, why not? Try it. It was foolish. I had 2 attempts. I wasn't successful. I haven't failed everything I've done in life, by the way. But ultimately, I wasn't successful. And I thought, so I said to my nav, I'm stopping. He said, press on. I thought if I do carry on, it'll prevent the rest of my team from having a go. And we collectively had a job to do that night. And if it didn't involve me due to my lack of skill, training or experience, then I had others more qualified. So I overruled him, went across onto the wing. My boss, my number 3, my exec officer, refueled successfully and went back and destroyed the target. And I landed back at base and I just felt like a failure. I felt like I shouldn't be here. I was hit by imposter syndrome, all of those things. And then a hand appeared on my shoulder and it was my nav, and he just said, man, that was a really good call. And I said, what was that whole press on thing? And he said, I should never have said it. He said, My last job, I was a trials officer and I had 3 years on the development and the testing of the weapon we happen to be carrying tonight. And it's never been dropped, this weapon, in any theatre of war in the world. And I wanted to be the first person to drop this bomb in anger. Only you didn't know that and you were not emotionally involved. So you were thinking really rationally. And it was the most refreshing thing ever because, you know, we'd been taught all the time about psychological safety and challenging and having a voice, making sure your voice is heard. And in that moment, I realised, you know, I had been empowered to lead. I'd made a decision. The decision had sat on my shoulders. I was accountable. All of this training came in that one moment. And not only did we, you know, successfully evade the missile that was shot at us, but we successfully as a team destroyed the target we were given as well. And actually, the debrief, we heard that we were one of the only formations who were successful that night. So all in all, I think I learned more about myself than I did on any other night in my entire flying career.
Yeah, amazing. And
is that a good minute? 2 minutes, 3 minutes? Oh gosh, sorry, Ryan.
it's when you just sit here just listening and obviously your imagination is going to try and
fill the gap.
Film it for you.
Yeah.
I guess as well. Visualize it. That actually happened to you. Here we are sitting in a studio and you were flying in a hostile environment and a surface-to-air missile is locked on to your aircraft.
Yeah, pretty scary stuff. On a happier note, and on a quicker 1 minute, one of my most pleasurable experiences was meeting Tom Cruise. Okay, so I was at the Royal International Air Tattoo and bloody Jo Salter had got to host Tom for the entire day. And I'd given her a copy of my book. It was in her hand. And I was standing there doing these hilarious selfies going, it's Tom in the background, while Jo is hosting him. And there's a whole story behind that one as well, which I won't go into now. But I do banter Jo mercilessly about it. And anyway, there was the chief of the air staff, Sir Mike Wigston, was there, and he said, and I served with Mike, or Wiggy as we called him, and he said, Mandy, hop over the barrier and come and meet Tom. I was like, don't ask me twice. Stag leaped over, basically ended up lunging at Tom, taking a selfie with basically me looking like I was smaller than him, which is hilarious because I'm 6 foot and he was about 5'5". But I said, he said to me, I said, oh, you're one of my heroes. And he said, oh, Mandy, don't be ridiculous. I'm an actor. You guys are the heroes. Boom.
Yeah.
That is the moment.
That's cool.
Yeah, that was a cool one.
And he's got your book.
And he's got my book and I signed it for him. I mean, he's on the phone constantly asking me, can he make it into a film? I've had to say, no, Tom, not at the moment. I'm really busy, really busy.
Do you want to do like a really cringe corporate intro, like as if you just forget the Mandy you are and just go,
oh, God.
Just because you seem like you've got a really, really fun personality and I think you could actually just...
If you too want to be inspired by, you know, a real trailblazer, then this is the book for you. Yes, an officer, not a gentleman.
Why that title?
It was a chapter title, actually. I was going to call the book Break Right, or I was going to call the book A Bird's Eye View. And I thought it was brilliant because my call sign at one point was Big Bird. Thank you to Sesame Street for that one. I was hoping to be like, you know, Ice Maiden. So Big Bird, I thought bird's eye view, different perspective, looking down from above and being a woman. And then my husband said, no, you've worked so hard to get rid of bird as a derogatory term. That will create so much of an issue. And so actually An Officer Not a Gentleman was the title of the chapter of me going through officer training when I was told to be more feminine because I was not feminine enough for them and because I drank a pint of beer in the bar and apparently women did not do that. So I therefore went on to 2 half pints, you see, instead of the pint to make my point. But so I went with An Officer Not a Gentleman instead.
Well, Ryan thought it was a great title. I think it's a great title. It does sound like a film title.
It does. I mean, Richard Gere, who knows? I mean, he's obviously made something that was a bit similar.
Well, tell us about it. Obviously, there was the pint incident. But,
there was a pint incident, yeah.
What's the drive behind it, the demographic for it? How's it been doing?
Yeah, it was a really interesting one. I think when I wrote it purely because every single time I did a speech, someone said, have you written a book? And I used to say, no, I can't write. And then I started saying, no, not yet. And I tell you what, if there's something you're putting off and you're starting saying, no, just say not yet, because then your brain starts to try and work out a way that you can do it. And so as soon as I started to say not yet, I thought, how can I actually get that into fruition. So I started to work with a really great friend of mine, Rob, who's a partner of one of my best friends. And I was at university with him, and he's a journalist and a great writer. So the two of us worked collaboratively together on it. And we got An Officer Not a Gentleman out. And it was really interesting because I think I'd been so excited about getting it out. And then the second it hits the streets, suddenly you think, oh my gosh, now everyone can read my story. And then I was filled with this horror of, oh my gosh, what's like everyone in the military going to think, and all of these thoughts. But I thought the demographic would be for the people I tend to do my speeches to, which would be quite corporate, typical, 25 to 50-year-olds. What I've actually found is it has been read by so many young people now. So it's sold over 35,000 copies now, globally. I say globally, 14 different countries so far. And considering it was rejected by all publishing houses, I self-published it. So self-published on Amazon. I use my little printer, Tony, in Winchester. He prints me copies. And I since have been approached by some rather large publishing houses. And actually, I realised that I love being in charge of my own destiny with it. I love the fact that actually I can send it out to people. I can print as many copies. I can do whatever I want with it. And it's my book now. And if I was to do a second book, which we are in the process of just finishing, actually, I'm definitely going to self-publish again rather than going down the publishing route. And I think that's how things have changed. But in the back of our minds, we've still got, I want to be published. Well, I think 35,000 copies is safe to say it has been published.
That's huge.
But what I'm loving is the who gets in touch with me now. And it's young people saying this book has inspired me. And that has been really amazing that, people that hear me speak, they buy it for their children, for their nephews, their nieces, for godchildren. And they're all now getting in touch with me on social media. And I probably answer about 4 or 5 messages a day on different platforms, all asking me different questions, which I absolutely love.
And you've learned how to write back to people. So can I ask you some questions?
No. Well, fortunately, because they're young people, I can just go, don't do that. Yes, you can do that. Don't do blah, 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 because they quite like it to be
it's
succinct.
Far easier.
Yeah, it's much easier. And you don't need to put like full stops or anything in there.
Don't have to beat about the bush. But you mentioned before we started recording, I was like, when was your last podcast? You mentioned the F word and a 16-year-old girl. I want to give her a shout out.
Give her a shout out, Daniela. Absolutely. So I love this. I mean, she got in touch with me last week. She said, I'm setting up a podcast called The F Word, Extremely Fast Females. And they're going to interview women from all different, she's doing a windsurfer. There's myself. You'll have fast runners, speed cars, all of those sort of things. And she did a lot of go-karting. She was really keen to be a fast jet pilot. That was her dream, but she's got juvenile arthritis, which is going to prevent her from doing that. But what I absolutely loved was the fact that she was just trying to do something different. And I think, you know what, a 16-year-old that's setting up a podcast. So I said, yes. And I went on her podcast on Monday. Her dad rang me yesterday and said, thank you so much for doing it. But it's about saying yes to things like that as well, because you know what, the amount of confidence she will gain, the skill sets she will gain. You know how hard it is when you're doing a podcast. You've got to think on the hoof. You've got to be dynamic in your questions. Otherwise it gets stilted. And she was doing all of those. And I said to her afterwards, you should be really proud of what you're doing. And I really hope it's going to be a big success.
Yeah. Do we know where she wants it to go?
I don't know at the moment. No, I think she's literally just starting it. So let's hope it takes off for her.
And is it on YouTube or?
I think she's recording about 10 episodes and then she's going to start to get it out onto different ones.
Well, everyone keep an eye on it. Ear and an eye out for the F word. Back to your call sign, the Big Bird. Yeah. Were you ever part of the Flamboyance?
I am the Flamboyance.
You are the Flamboyance.
Yeah. So myself, Kirsty Murphy, who was Tornado GR4 and then Red Arrows, and Joe, we were together. And I'll send you a photo, you can stick it on this one. But there's the 3 of us in a bar and we were like, God, there are so few female fast jet pilots here. What should we call ourselves? And I put it out onto social media, this picture, and I asked them what's the collective noun for a group of female Tornado pilots. And the words that came back were horrific and can't be repeatable here today. But the one that I loved was, you're a flamboyance. And I thought, I'm sticking with that one because it was the only one clean enough. But flamboyance, I thought, what a brilliant title, because we've all had to be flamboyant in our own way, and yet coming together in a flamboyance of pilots is absolutely brilliant, of aircrew. And in fact, so we're going to start to get a bit of a movement of getting together actually in our flamboyance, but we do see each other quite regularly.
Yeah, I asked Jo because she said she didn't have a call sign, but mentioned the flamboyance. So we've got the original member.
Yeah, myself, Jo and Kirsty, the original threesome of the flamboyants.
Amazing. But officially, you don't have call signs, do you? So Big Bird was a nickname?
Yeah, I mean, that was on my name badge, basically.
Right.
So people would have called me that at different times. You have often on a Friday night badge, but you will have people that do have call signs that they will be known as. And, I mean, one that comes to mind would be, say, like Sumo. Nobody knew that his name was something completely different because everyone just knew him as Sumo. So it just depends, if it's a call sign that is given to someone really early on in their career. There was a guy I met at the Remembrance Parade on Sunday, and he said, "Oh, Mandy, it's so-and-so." And I was like, "What?" And he goes, "Muppet." I was like, "Oh, Muppet," because of course you don't know them by any of their real names. And these guys come up on social media. I'm thinking, who's Keith? And I'm like, oh, it's Shugs. Who's that? Oh, it's so-and-so. So yeah, I know them by their call signs, but obviously they've left the military now, so they refer them to real names.
Mentioned Remembrance Sunday. Were you at the Cenotaph?
Yeah, I did a march past on the Cenotaph, actually. It's the first time I've ever done it. I found it really emotional, really moving. And this year is 25 years since I lost two guys I was on a squadron with, Sean Casabeo and Dickie Wright. And I helped them stick together their maps. They went off and flew a mission and they never came back. They flew into the ground just near Newcastle on a training sortie. And the horror of losing squadron members, people, that you're actually are with 1 minute and then they're gone the next. People always think about remembrance being about losing the people that died in conflict. But actually, for people probably don't realise how many lives are lost in training. And certainly in today's more modern conflict, we probably lose as many through training as we do through conflict. And it was a horrific day. And going there, and it was 25 years in October since we lost them. And it was a poignant day, and it was a really great one to see so many different people there as well, and a very emotional experience all round.
Yeah, because this is today's the 13th of November. This episode should go out at the end of this month. But obviously, it's only just been. And I've not actually spoken to ex-service personnel about it and what it means, because it's Armistice Day, so it's specific for First World War. Yeah, but it's relevant. Like you said, it doesn't necessarily need to be remembering those who served in, it's just those who served.
It's those who've served, absolutely. So, in fact, I went to see a really, really incredible production recently. So you've had JP on here, John Nichols, who's the nav that was shot down at the same time as John Peters. He was in the back seat. He's gone on to be a really successful author and written loads and loads of books. And he's written one called The Unknown Warrior. And actually, he was on tour and he was taking that book as a production around all these theatres. And I went to see it in my local theatre. And actually, it was the story of the unknown warrior that's buried in Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey? Yeah, it is Westminster Abbey, isn't it? Yeah. And it's the only grave that no one ever walks over. It has poppies around the outside of it. And it was the history behind the person that is in that grave, and the fact that it represented every single person that was killed on that battlefield that could never be brought back, because they made a decision not to bring any bodies back, because some of them they couldn't, and ultimately this is unknown. They went to 4 different sites around France and picked a body from each one. They brought them to this church, and then someone else came in, so that there was completely anonymous. No one could know where this body had come from. So when this body came back, it was the equivalent of a state funeral. People were lining the streets with comments of, that could be my husband in there. And the power of that, and I think seeing that around Remembrance Day, and just thinking of the loss of life, 57,000 people died on the first Battle of the Somme, the Day of the Somme, one day. That's like the whole of my town in Winchester, my city, is wiped out in one day. All men. And it's just horrific when you actually think of that loss of life. And in comparison to, say, Afghanistan, where they've lost 8 on the worst day, 57,000 young men. And yeah, we do need to remember, because it was literally for the people who have served, giving up their lives so that we can have the lives that we have now. Sorry, that's not a happy note.
No, it just, I want to go deeper and share opinions, but it was never going to be a political podcast. But it does, there's a lot of things about the life that people live today that sometimes irritates me, because we forget
Yeah, I think it is easy. And hence that lest we forget. Please let us never forget the sacrifice all of these people have made.
And how lucky people are today because of that.
Absolutely. And I think, when you do speeches and you often get asked, how could you do the job you did? Well, I did the job I did so that you can have the life that you have. Ultimately, that is the reality of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're not all just flying around at air shows. It was that surface to air missile could have had a very different outcome.
Yeah. And I mean, when I talk about the two guys, Sean and Dickie, that died, another guy, Steve Todd, died that same week in another aeroplane crash in a Hawk. So these were all people I knew. You do lose people. And, that part of being in the military, that risk that you take every day that you get airborne is very real.
Our thoughts were with them, obviously 25 years. And because it was Remembrance Sunday. Thank you for speaking about that. Is there anything, Mandy, that we should cover before we wrap up? I think we're approaching like a nice time. I think we've covered a lot, actually. It's been refreshing to talk about different sorts of subjects as well. So I hope it's been of interest. And it's been fascinating to chat to you. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, definitely. One of those podcasts where you feel like actually it could go on for another 2 parts.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah,
is a good one. So I really appreciate you joining us on Air Chats.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Cheers.